The great city resembled a disturbed anthill in those days. I had never seen anything like it in all my years living within these walls. Nobody attended to their usual business anymore. The shops and workshops that had buzzed with activity since dawn were now shuttered tight, their wooden doors barred as if to keep out some terrible plague. The docks, where merchants from across the Mediterranean had once haggled over precious goods, stood eerily silent. Foreign ships had fled with their cargo still aboard, their captains unwilling to risk being trapped in whatever storm was coming. Hit subscribe and the bell icon to discover amazing historical stories with us every week. I found myself swept along with the crowds that poured into the streets, all of us consumed by the same gnawing anxiety that came with each new rumor. We gathered in small groups on every corner, sharing whispered fragments of news, each story more terrifying than the last. The very air seemed to vibrate with our collective fear. Women clutched their children closer, old men shook their heads and muttered prayers to Tanit and Moloch. Young men stood with clenched fists, their eyes blazing with a fury they had nowhere to direct. The massive crowd that filled the entire space between the semicircle of the inner harbor and the council house had been waiting since before sunrise. We pressed together, shoulder to shoulder, our patience wearing thin as the hours dragged by. The morning sun climbed higher, beating down on our heads, but none of us moved. We all knew that our fate hung in the balance, decided by men in distant Rome who had never walked our streets or breathed our air. When the ambassadors had first departed for Rome weeks earlier, many of us had dared to hope. Surely reasonable men could find a peaceful solution. Surely the Romans, having already reduced us to a shadow of our former power, would be satisfied with our submission. We had dismantled our army, sent away our fleet, agreed to pay the crushing tribute they demanded. What more could they want? The terrible news they brought back shattered those naive hopes like pottery thrown against stone. Rome had declared war on Carthage. 2 full armies under the command of the consuls had already marched from the city and were boarding ships bound for Africa. The Third Punic War had begun, and we were as helpless as lambs before wolves. How could we have been so unprepared? The question tormented me as I stood among the crowd. We had no fleet capable of preventing the Romans from landing on our shores. The ships that might have defended us lay scattered across the Mediterranean, their crews disbanded, their bronze rams melted down for coin. We had no army that could drive the invaders back into the sea. The forces we had assembled to defend against Massinissa's raids had been dissolved at Rome's demand, and their commander, Hasdrubal, had been sentenced to death and vanished into the desert like smoke. These measures had been taken to give the Romans no excuse for war. How bitter that irony tasted now! Our council had believed that by showing complete submission, by rendering ourselves utterly defenseless, we might purchase peace. Instead, we had only made ourselves easier prey. In desperation, the council had chosen ambassadors with unlimited powers, men authorized to agree to any terms that might save the city. I had watched them depart, these dignified elders in their finest robes, carrying the hopes of 300,000 souls. They had been received in the Roman Senate, where they announced that Carthage surrendered unconditionally to Rome and was prepared to fulfill any demand. At first, it seemed our capitulation might be accepted favorably. The Roman senators, with their practiced smiles and honeyed words, declared that in recognition of our wise decision, They would grant the Carthaginians self-governance and the right to possess all state and private property. How our people had rejoiced when this news reached us. In the streets, strangers embraced. Wine flowed freely. We dared to believe that the sword raised above our heads had been stayed, but then came the praetor's additional announcement, delivered with the casual cruelty that Romans had perfected into an art. The Carthaginians would receive these promised privileges only after delivering 300 hostages, sons of senators and prominent citizens, to the Sicilian port of Lilybaeum within 30 days. Furthermore, they must comply with whatever additional demands the consuls might make. The ambassadors had raced back to Carthage with this news, overtaking the ships carrying the 2 consular armies. The Carthaginian council approved their actions, but the praetor's words stirred deep unease. Nothing had been said about the city of Carthage itself, only about state and private property. What other demands would the consuls present? The distinction felt ominous, like thunder on a clear day. After long hours of debate and bitter arguments, lots were drawn to compile the list of hostages. I watched families torn apart by that cruel lottery. Fathers who had never shown emotion wept openly. Mothers collapsed in the streets. The decision had been made after much hesitation and dispute, but faced with the threat of war, submission had triumphed over pride. The following morning, the commercial harbor's waterfront echoed with desperate cries that still haunt my dreams. Mothers ran along the shore like madwomen, their elaborate hairstyles disheveled, their makeup streaked with tears. They grabbed sailors by the arms, pressed bags of sweets into their hands, begged to be allowed aboard the ships. I saw them clawing at their painted cheeks with bright fingernails, tearing their expensive clothing to rags in their anguish. Surrounding the helmsman who had been tasked with transporting the children to Lilybaeum, they screamed accusations that chilled my blood. "Child eater! Give me back my boy!" The helmsman pressed his palms against his ears, trying to block out their voices. "Be quiet," he attempted to shout over them. "Your husbands gave up the children. What do you want from me?" With the help of his sailors, he managed to break free from the grip of the frenzied women. Standing on the ship as it slowly pulled away from shore, the helmsman said to his assistant, his voice heavy with sorrow, "I wish I had black sails." "Black sails?" his assistant wondered. "A Greek once told me that when the Athenians sent their young men and women to feed the Cretan monster Minotaur, they rigged their ships with black sails." Suddenly, the helmsman grabbed his assistant's shoulder and cried out, "Look!" Behind the ship swam a woman, someone's mother. You could see her strength failing her. For a moment she stopped, stretching out her arms as if she wanted to grasp the ship, then swam on. The wind filled the sails. The ship left the harbor, but the woman continued swimming, as if hoping to catch up with it, until she disappeared beneath the waves. The image of that drowning mother became seared into the collective memory of our city. She became a symbol of our helplessness, our desperate love for our children, and our growing realization that Rome's appetite for our destruction knew no bounds. When the young hostages were delivered to Sicily, I felt as though a piece of my own soul had been torn away. Though I had no children among them, every citizen of Carthage understood that we were witnessing the systematic destruction of our future. These boys, the brightest and most promising of our youth, were now pawns in Rome's cruel game. The consul's next demands arrived like hammer blows. Surrender all weapons and remove all warships from the harbor. I watched in numb horror as endless rows of carts and wagons rolled out of the city, loaded with swords, javelins, spears, shields, and pieces of catapult. The metallic symphony of our military might reduced to the dull clatter of scrap metal being hauled away to satisfy Roman greed. From the harbor, they led out our ships and set them ablaze in the roadstead. Our fleet burned before our very eyes, and I swear I could feel the heat of those flames on my face, even from the city walls. The Romans calculated that this spectacle would finally break our spirit, and they were nearly right. To see the vessels that had once carried Carthaginian merchants and warriors across the known world reduced to charred skeletons floating in our own harbor, it was a death of dreams, of identity, of everything that had made us who we were. But Rome was not finished with us. Another delegation of 10 senators was summoned to Utica to receive new orders. The entire city waited for their return, and I was among those who climbed the walls and gathered beyond the city gates. As evening approached, the anxious silence was broken by a loud shout. "They come!" But what had happened to our ambassadors? Why did they raise their hands to the sky and then beat themselves on the chest, crying out incoherently? For a moment, I wondered if actors from some tragedy by Euripides had disguised themselves as our delegates, using their movements to portray grief and despair. But no, these were not masks. These were our ambassadors, and they brought news that the inhabitants must abandon the city and settle wherever Rome commanded. "Ah!" rose the cry, a sound I had never heard before. The collective death scream of a civilization. In an instant, the walls emptied. Craftsmen and sailors filled the square before the great council building. Now they were not waiting but demanding, pounding with fists and feet on the bronze-reinforced doors. The terrified Suffet came out onto the terrace to calm the crowd, but his voice was drowned out by the roar. "Weapons! Weapons!" The Suffet gestured that there were no weapons, trying to shout over the crowd that the arms had been handed over to the Romans, but the mob would hear none of it. They wanted blood, they wanted revenge, they wanted hope, and all of these things required weapons. "Weapons!" the crowd bellowed, advancing on the Suffet. "There!" he gasped, pointing with a trembling finger. "In the arsenal." The arsenal lay within the cavities of the city wall, which was 30 cubits thick. There were also stables for elephants and horses. The iron gates of the arsenal were locked. The Suffet would not give up the keys, and for a moment the crowd was confused. What to do? Then people with crowbars and axes pushed forward. They smashed the massive locks and tore off the hinges. People rushed inside, their hopes high, their desperation driving them forward. But the arsenal was empty, completely, utterly empty. Ah! This was the roar of an enraged beast, the sound of betrayal finally understood. These people, who had never been allowed to participate in governing the state, who had never been consulted, felt they had been betrayed by their own leaders. The wealthy merchants and aristocrats who made up the council had sold out not just the city's defenses, but the people themselves. But perhaps the elephants remained? These massive war beasts, the terror of Roman legions. Surely they had not all been surrendered to the elephants, to the elephants. The elephants were our last hope, the final symbol of Carthaginian military might. But the elephant stables, too, proved empty. The deluded people stirred the half-rotten hay as if an elephant might be hiding there. They tore their hair and clawed their cheeks with their fingernails. the physical pain a pale reflection of the agony in their souls. "To Megara!" the crowd roared. To Megara. Megara was the wealthy district where our aristocrats lived in luxury, drowning in the greenery of their gardens, while the common people struggled to make sense of the catastrophe that had befallen us. Canals that washed the garden plots brought coolness to their private paradise. On the shining bronze mirror surface of ponds, swans floated carelessly, untouched by the terrible misfortune that had crashed down upon the city. It seemed that here nobody was troubled by the disaster that threatened to erase Carthage from the map forever. This disconnect between the suffering masses and the comfortable elite became the spark that ignited our revolution. Under the pressure of shoulders and elbows, under the blows of feet, the gates of the mansions cracked and splintered. The crowd burst inside, smashing precious furniture and dishes, dragging terrified wealthy citizens from their hiding places under beds and in storage rooms. "These are the ones who gave our weapons to the enemy. Death to them." From the underground cells they brought out slaves, exhausted, with bruises and scars on their bodies. Blinded by the bright light after years in darkness, they squinted and rubbed their eyes, not yet knowing what had happened. They stretched out their hands to their rescuers. "Now you are free!" people shouted at them, pointing to the torn bodies of their former masters. Thousands of slaves poured into the crowd and flowed back with them into the city. The social order that had existed for centuries crumbled in a single afternoon. Masters became corpses, slaves became revolutionaries, and the established hierarchy of Carthaginian society dissolved in blood and fury. This uprising was born not from political ideology, but from the raw desperation of people who finally understood the depth of their betrayal. For generations, the common citizens had trusted their leaders to protect the city. Now they realized that these same leaders had been secretly negotiating away their very existence. Piece by piece, concession by concession, until nothing remained but the hollow shell of a once great civilization. The revolution that swept through Megara that day was not just about revenge against the wealthy. It was about reclaiming agency over our own fate. If our leaders would not defend Carthage, then we would defend it ourselves. If they would not arm us, we would forge our own weapons. If they would not resist Rome's impossible demands, we would show them what true Carthaginian defiance looked like. Never before had Carthage been as beautiful as it was in those days of righteous fury. I had lived through many crises in my years, but nothing compared to the transformation I witnessed as our city awakened from its stupor of submission. The despair and anxiety that had paralyzed us for weeks gave way to a calm determination that filled every street, every workshop, every heart. The change began at the great council square, where a line formed of those who wished to donate their precious possessions to the cause of our defense. I watched wealthy merchants who had spent their lives accumulating gold and silver, now eagerly casting their treasures onto a growing pile that glittered in the morning sun. Alongside their donations, they brought furnaces, anvils, and bellows. The tools of creation would be turned to the purpose of war. But we faced an immediate problem: fuel. The forges needed fire, and wood was scarce. Without hesitation, the people began tearing apart the benches where the counselors who had betrayed Carthage once sat in comfort. Tables followed, then chests of ebony wood, then anything that could burn. The very symbols of our failed leadership became kindling for our resurrection. Still, we lacked sufficient metal for weapons. Into the furnaces went bronze statues of private individuals, though we spared the images of our gods. For even in revolution, we maintained our reverence for Tanit and Moloch. The muscles on the blacksmith's shoulders swelled as they worked. The heavy blows of hammers rang out across the square, a new music of defiance that drowned out the old songs of surrender. Work was found even for the barbers. Women formed lines before them, young and old, rich and poor, united in purpose. I watched as braids and tresses fell to the ground, black, blonde, gray hair, creating a small mountain of sacrifice. Immediately, this hair was woven into rope for the catapults. Every strand became a weapon, every sacrifice a statement of resolve. Carthage was beautiful in those days because it boiled with righteous anger. The city had found its soul again, and that soul burned brighter than any forge. Men who had never spoken to each other worked side by side. Women who had been rivals in the market now shared tools and materials. Children who should have been playing ran messages between the workshops. We had become one people with one purpose: to defend our home against those who would erase us from the earth. The transformation was not just material but spiritual. For too long, we had accepted the narrative that Carthage was finished, that our glory days were behind us, that we deserved whatever fate Rome chose to impose. Now we remembered who we were: the heirs of Dido, the children of Hannibal, the people who had once made Rome tremble. That heritage flowed back into our veins like wine, intoxicating and empowering. I threw myself into this work alongside everyone else. My hands, which had grown soft from years of comfortable living, became calloused again as they had been in my youth. I helped carry bronze statues to the furnaces, held metal steady while the smiths shaped it into sword blades, and shared in the communal meals that kept us working through the night. Sleep became secondary to this great purpose that had seized us all. The foreigners among us, merchants, sailors, even Roman citizens who happened to be in the city, watched our transformation with amazement and growing fear. They had expected to witness the death throes of a defeated city. Instead, they saw Carthage being reborn in fire and determination. Many quietly slipped away in the night, carrying word to the Roman camps of what they had seen. As our weapons took shape, so did our organization. Natural leaders emerged from the crowd. Not the old aristocrats who had failed us, but craftsmen who understood how to organize work. Former soldiers who remembered the arts of war, and citizens whose passion for our city burned brightest. They began to impose order on our efforts, creating schedules for the forges, assigning responsibilities, and planning for the siege we knew was coming. Women played a crucial role that went far beyond donating their hair. They organized food distribution, tended to the children, and maintained the civic functions that kept life possible during our transformation. I saw grandmothers teaching young girls how to make arrows, mothers explaining to their sons why they must be brave, wives working alongside their husbands at tasks that would have been unthinkable just days before. The former slaves, now free citizens of our reborn city, brought skills and knowledge that proved invaluable. Some had worked in Roman camps and understood their military methods. Others had labored in mines and metalworks, bringing expertise we desperately needed. Their integration into our society was swift and complete. Former masters and former slaves now stood equal in the face of our common enemy. Children adapted to this new reality with the resilience that youth provides. They played new games that mimicked the work of their parents, pretending to forge weapons and defend the walls. Their laughter mixed with the sounds of hammering and provided a reminder of what we were fighting to preserve. These children would grow up free in Carthage, or they would not grow up at all. There was no middle ground. When exhaustion threatened to overcome us, when the magnitude of our task seemed impossible, we would remind each other of Rome's final demand: abandon our city and settle wherever they commanded. The thought of being scattered like seeds to the wind, of watching Carthage reduced to rubble while we lived as beggars in foreign lands, gave us strength to continue. We would rather die defending our walls than live as exiles mourning our lost home. The sound of our hammers carried beyond the city walls, and we knew the Roman advance scouts could hear it. Let them report back to their commanders that Carthage was not the helpless victim they expected to find. Let them know that we had remembered how to fight, how to hope, how to stand together against impossible odds. The fire of our rebellion would burn until either we were victorious or Rome had to destroy every last stone of our city to claim its prize. What do you think about this historical event? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. When our tension had reached what seemed its absolute limit, when every muscle in the city ached from the constant work of preparation, someone spotted an army approaching our walls from the desert. My heart seized with terror. Had the Romans arrived ahead of schedule? Had our frantic efforts been in vain? But no. These were not Roman eagles glinting in the desert sun. As the dust cleared and the figures drew closer, a cry of recognition went up from the watchers on the wall. This was Hasdrubal leading 3,000 mercenaries across the sand, emerging from the wasteland like a ghost returning from the realm of the dead. Hasdrubal, the man condemned to death by our own council in their desperate attempt to appease Rome. The commander who had vanished into the desert like a mirage, leaving behind only whispered rumors and fading hope. Now, he had returned at our darkest hour, when we needed a hero most desperately. The gods themselves seemed to have answered our prayers. I was among the crowd that rushed to the gates, and I will never forget the sound that rose from our throats. Not just joy, but something deeper, more primal. It was the sound of a people rediscovering their capacity for hope after weeks of despair. Hasdrubal, Savior, Suffet, we roared, the words tumbling over each other, as we pressed forward to welcome our salvation. For the first time in 700 years of Carthage's existence, a Suffet was elected in violation of all established rules, not by secret ballot among council members in quiet chambers, but openly, through the will of the people expressed in the streets. I cast my voice into that thunderous acclamation, along with every other citizen present. Democracy had come to Carthage not through philosophical debate, but through desperate necessity. The crowd lifted Hasdrubal and carried him toward the council house on their shoulders. I pressed close enough to see his face, red as if burned by the desert sun, weathered by months of exile but blazing with determination. He was shouting something, but his thin voice was drowned out by our jubilant roar, "Suffet! Suffet!" The dark-skinned mercenaries who had followed him out of the desert watched this spectacle with amazement, not understanding what had caused such rejoicing. Our people began throwing flowers at them, embracing them, kissing them. These foreign warriors, who had probably come to Carthage expecting to find a defeated city waiting for Roman occupation, instead found themselves caught up in a carnival of renewed hope. Hasdrubal's return transformed everything. Suddenly, our desperate preparations took on new meaning. We were no longer just people pretending to be soldiers. we had a real commander, a man who had fought the Romans and survived. The weapons we had forged in our makeshift armories would be wielded by someone who knew how to use them. The walls we had strengthened would be defended by a leader who understood the art of war. I learned later about Hasdrubal's months in exile, and his story only increased my admiration for the man. When the council had condemned him to appease Roman demands, he had not fled in shame or despair. Instead, he had gathered a small band of loyal followers and disappeared into the Sahara, where few civilized men dared to venture. There, among the nomadic tribes who had no love for Rome, he had slowly built a new army. The mercenaries he brought back were a mixed lot. Numidians who rode horses as easily as other men walked. Libyans who had learned to hate Roman tax collectors. Escaped slaves who preferred death in battle to life in chains. And adventurers from across North Africa who were drawn by the promise of plunder and glory. They were not the disciplined legions that Rome would bring against us, but they were warriors who had chosen to fight rather than submit. More importantly, Hasdrubal's return proved that resistance was possible. Here was a man who had been written off as dead, who had survived in the desert wastes, who had gathered an army from nothing. If he could accomplish this miracle, then perhaps other miracles were possible. Perhaps Carthage could indeed survive the coming storm. The ceremony that elevated Hasdrubal to the position of Suffet was unlike anything in our city's history. Instead of the solemn ritual conducted in private chambers according to ancient precedent, this was a festival of the streets. Children threw flower petals from rooftops. Musicians who had been silent during our weeks of despair now played triumphant melodies. The smell of roasting meat filled the air as people brought out their hoarded food stores to celebrate. But even in the midst of celebration, Hasdrubal wasted no time in beginning his real work. Within hours of his arrival, he was inspecting our defenses, reviewing our weapons production, and organizing our civilian volunteers into something resembling military units. He moved through the city like a man possessed, and his energy was infectious. People who had been exhausted by weeks of frantic preparation found new strength in his presence. I volunteered to serve in whatever capacity he deemed fit, and found myself assigned to help coordinate the defense of the harbor district. It was humbling work, carrying messages, helping to position the few catapults we had managed to construct, and learning to use the spear that had been thrust into my hands. At my age, I had never expected to become a soldier, but these were times that transformed everyone. Hasdrubal's tactical knowledge became apparent as he reorganized our defenses. The walls that we had strengthened haphazardly were reinforced at key points. The weapons we had produced without clear plan were distributed according to a coherent strategy. Most importantly, he began training the most promising volunteers in the basic skills they would need to fight as a unit rather than a mob. The dark-skinned mercenaries proved invaluable as instructors. They had fought in desert warfare, siege warfare, and the small-scale conflicts that were constant features of North African life. They taught our citizens how to use their new weapons effectively, how to maintain formation under pressure, and how to support each other in battle. The gulf between professional warrior and civilian volunteer was vast, but under their guidance, it began to narrow. As word of Hasdrubal's return spread beyond our walls, other developments began to unfold. Runners brought news that some of the Numidian tribes, encouraged by this sign of Carthaginian defiance, were reconsidering their allegiance to Rome. A few scattered towns that had already submitted to Roman demands sent secret messages expressing their willingness to rebel if Carthage could hold out long enough to give them hope. Carthage had become more than just a city defending itself. We were the symbol of resistance to Roman domination across North Africa. Every day we survived would encourage others to remember their own independence. Every Roman soldier we killed would demonstrate that the legions were not invincible. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity. For the first time since the crisis began, I dared to believe that we might actually have a chance. The days following Hasdrubal's elevation to Suffet passed in a blur of intense preparation. I found myself caught up in a transformation that went far beyond mere military readiness. We were rebuilding the very soul of Carthage from the ground up. Where once there had been the rigid hierarchy of merchants, aristocrats, and common citizens, now there was a new order based on contribution to our common defense. Hasdrubal proved to be not just a war leader but a master organizer. Within a week, he had established training schedules that maximized the use of our limited space and resources. The Great Council Square became a parade ground, where former shopkeepers learned to march in formation. The harbor district, emptied of its merchant vessels, became an archery range where women and older men practiced with the bows we had hastily constructed. I was assigned to work with the siege engineers, a handful of men who had served in earlier conflicts and now struggled to remember the principles of defensive warfare. We faced the daunting task of turning Carthage's impressive but largely decorative walls into a genuine military fortification. The 30-cubit thickness of our walls was an advantage, but centuries of peace had left us with gates designed for commerce rather than defense, and towers built more for show than for effective military use. The first Roman ships appeared on the horizon 18 days after Hasdrubal's return. I was on the wall when the lookout's cry went up, and I felt my stomach clench with fear despite all our preparations. In the distance, the white sails seemed innocent enough, but we all knew what they carried. These were not merchants coming to trade, but an invasion force, bent on our complete destruction. Hasdrubal ordered signal fires lit on the highest towers, and within hours, answering flames could be seen from the interior. Word was spreading across the countryside that the final confrontation had begun. Whether this would bring us aid or merely alert potential collaborators to Rome's arrival remained to be seen. The Roman fleet was massive, far larger than our worst fears had imagined. Ship after ship appeared on the horizon until the sea itself seemed covered with their sails. The combined consular armies represented perhaps 50,000 men, along with their supporting auxiliary forces, siege equipment, and supplies for a prolonged campaign. Against this, we could field perhaps 15,000 defenders, many of whom had held weapons for the first time just weeks earlier. But numbers told only part of the story. The Romans expected to find a demoralized city, ready to surrender at the first show of force. Instead, their scouts would report back about the activity they could observe even from the harbor, the movement of armed men on the walls, the smoke from our forges still working day and night, the defiant banners that had been raised above our gates. Hasdrubal called a final assembly of all defenders as the Roman ships began their approach to our shores. I pressed into the crowd gathered in the great council square, the same space where we had first learned of Rome's impossible demands. How different everything seemed now. Where once we had stood in helpless despair, Now we gathered as warriors ready to fight for our city. Citizens of Carthage, Hasdrubal's voice carried clearly across the square. Trained by years of commanding troops in battle, the Romans come expecting to find sheep ready for slaughter. Instead, they will face lions defending their den. The cheer that rose from the crowd was different from the desperate hope that had greeted his return. This was the controlled ferocity of people who had found their courage and were ready to use it. I added my voice to that roar, surprising myself with the strength of my own emotion. They demand that we abandon our city and scatter like dust in the wind. Hasdrubal continued. They offer us slavery disguised as mercy, exile disguised as clemency. But Carthage was not built by men who accepted slavery, and it will not fall to men who know only how to destroy what they cannot create. He went on to outline our defensive strategy. The walls would be our primary strength, but not our only one. Teams of volunteers had been trained to sally forth and harass Roman siege works. Others would maintain the supply lines that connected us to the countryside, as long as such connections remained possible. Most importantly, we would show the world that Carthage could still fight if we must die. Hasdrubal concluded, we will die as free men and women. Our children will remember that when Rome came to erase us from history, we stood and fought. Whether they remember us as heroes or as fools will depend on how well we acquit ourselves in the coming battle. As the assembly dispersed, I sought out my assigned position on the harbor wall. The view from there provided a perfect vantage point to watch the Roman landing operations. Their organization was impressive. These were soldiers who had conquered most of the known world, and their efficiency showed it. They established their beachhead with methodical precision, setting up defensive perimeters before unloading their siege equipment. The sight of Roman catapults being assembled on our own shores filled me with a peculiar mixture of terror and anger. These engines would soon be hurling stones at walls I had helped to strengthen, at people I had worked alongside. The abstract threat of Roman conquest had become terrifyingly concrete, but alongside the fear came something else. A fierce pride in what we had accomplished. Just 2 months earlier, Rome's demands had reduced us to helpless panic. Now we watched their preparations with the steady gaze of people ready to fight. We had transformed ourselves from victims into warriors, and that transformation would not be easily undone. The first night after the Roman landing, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of their camp, the hammering as they constructed their siege works, the calls of sentries, the general bustle of a professional army settling in for a long campaign. These sounds should have terrified me, but instead they filled me with grim satisfaction. The Romans had come expecting a quick victory, but they were clearly preparing for something much more difficult. Dawn brought our first real glimpse of what we faced. The Roman camp spread across the plain before our walls like a small city, organized with the geometric precision that characterized everything they did. Their engines of war were already taking shape. Siege towers, battering rams, catapults designed to breach walls that had stood for centuries. Yet, even faced with this overwhelming display of military might, my spirits remained surprisingly high. We had done everything possible to prepare for this moment. Our walls were as strong as we could make them. Our weapons were ready. Our people were united in a way that Carthage had never experienced before. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen. But we had given ourselves a chance. Hasdrubal appeared on the walls shortly after sunrise, making his daily inspection of our defenses. When he reached my section, He paused to study the Roman preparations. "They're being very thorough," he observed. "That's good news for us." "Good news?" I asked, puzzled. "It means they respect us enough to prepare properly. An enemy who takes you seriously is preferable to one who expects an easy victory. The thorough ones make mistakes because they overthink. The overconfident ones are harder to predict." His confidence was infectious, and I found myself nodding in agreement. Perhaps we really did have a chance. Perhaps the fire that had been lit in Carthage's heart would prove strong enough to withstand the storm that was coming. The first Roman assault came at dawn on the 7th day after their landing, and it shattered the morning calm like a thunderclap. I had been manning my position on the harbor wall since before sunrise, watching the Roman camp stir to life, when suddenly their war horns began to sound. The deep brazen notes echoed across the plain, and I felt my blood freeze in my veins. "Here they come," shouted the watchman nearest to me. And indeed, the Roman lines were already moving forward with the mechanical precision that had conquered half the world, their shields locked together in perfect formation, their spears creating a bristling hedge of death. They advanced on our walls like some many-headed monster born from the depths of Hades itself. The sound that rose from our own walls in response was entirely different. Not the disciplined war cries of professional soldiers, but the raw, desperate shouts of people fighting for their homes and families. Women appeared on the ramparts carrying bundles of arrows. Children ran between the defenders with water and food. Old men, too frail to fight, offered prayers to Tanit and Moloch for our deliverance. Hasdrubal had positioned himself at the main gate, the most likely point for a Roman breakthrough attempt. Even from my position several hundred yards away, I could see his red cloak moving along the battlements as he encouraged the defenders and directed our response to the Roman approach. His presence seemed to multiply our effectiveness. Wherever he appeared, our people fought with renewed vigor. The Romans brought their siege engines forward under cover of their shield walls. These machines were works of engineering genius, all too familiar to anyone who had studied the history of Roman conquests. Massive catapults that could hurl stones the size of a man's head, siege towers that rose higher than our walls, bristling with archers and assault troops, battering rams covered with iron plates and suspended from wheeled frameworks that could absorb the impact of our defensive fire. Our own response was necessarily improvised but surprisingly effective. The catapults we had constructed from melted-down bronze statues might lack the precision of Roman engineering, but they served their purpose well enough. I watched one of our stone missiles crash into a Roman shield formation, scattering the soldiers like leaves before a hurricane. The cheer that went up from our walls at this success was audible even above the din of battle. The archers trained in our harbor district proved their worth as well. Roman soldiers attempting to approach the walls found themselves under constant fire from defenders who might lack formal military training but possessed the fierce motivation of people defending their own city. Every Roman casualty was a small victory that reinforced our belief that we could actually win this impossible struggle. But the Romans were nothing if not persistent. When their first assault was beaten back, they regrouped and tried again. When their siege towers were set ablaze by our fire arrows, they constructed new ones. When their battering rams were destroyed by stones dropped from the walls, they brought up fresh equipment. This was warfare as a science, conducted by men who had reduced the conquest of cities to a methodical process. The most terrifying moment of that first day came when a section of our wall near the main gate began to show cracks under the repeated impact of Roman battering rams. I could see the mortar crumbling, ancient stones shifting in their foundations, and I realized with growing horror that our defenses might not be as impregnable as we had hoped. Hasdrubal saw the danger as well. Within minutes, he had organized teams of defenders to shore up the weakening wall with timber and rubble. More importantly, he ordered a sally from the postern gate that caught the Roman ram crew by surprise. 100 of our best fighters, led by some of Hasdrubal's veteran mercenaries, burst out of the city and fell upon the siege engine before its escorts could react. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. These were not the neat formations of formal battle, but the savage, desperate struggle of men fighting for their lives at close quarters. I saw a Roman centurion, identifiable by his transverse crested helmet, trade sword blows with one of our former slaves. Both men were wounded, both exhausted, but neither would yield. When they finally fell together, locked in each other's arms, the poignancy of the moment struck me like a physical blow. Our sally succeeded in destroying the battering ram, but at a terrible cost. Of the 100 men who had charged out of the postern gate, fewer than 60 made it back alive. Among the dead was Marcus, a ship captain who had become one of my closest friends during our weeks of preparation. I had helped him learn to use a spear, and he had taught me the basics of archery. Now he lay crumpled in the dirt before our walls, his blood seeping into the same soil where he had been born. The Romans withdrew as darkness fell, leaving behind their dead and damaged equipment. We had survived the first day, but at what cost? As I helped carry the wounded into the city, I began to understand the true nature of the struggle we had committed ourselves to. This would not be a glorious battle decided in a single afternoon, but a grinding war of attrition that would test every resource we possessed. That night, I found myself unable to sleep despite my exhaustion. The cries of the wounded echoed through the streets, and the smoke from the funeral pyres cast eerie shadows on the walls of my house. The transformation that had seemed so inspiring just weeks earlier now felt like a march toward inevitable destruction. How long could we sustain losses like today's? How many more of my friends would die defending walls that might fall anyway? But when morning came and the Roman horn sounded again, I took my place on the wall without hesitation. Carthage had awakened something in me that I had never known existed, a willingness to die for something larger than myself. Whether we won or lost, whether we lived or died, we would face our fate as free people who had chosen to fight rather than submit. The second day brought new challenges and new horrors. The Romans had learned from their previous day's failures and adjusted their tactics accordingly. Instead of massed assaults on our strongest points, they probed for weaknesses all along our perimeter. Small groups of soldiers attempted to scale our walls with ladders, while larger forces kept our attention focused elsewhere. One such attempt nearly succeeded at a section of wall manned primarily by older citizens and women. I was close enough to see the terror in their eyes as Roman soldiers began to appear at the top of the battlements. For a moment, it seemed certain that they would establish a foothold inside our city. But then something remarkable happened. These civilians, who had never held weapons before the crisis began, found reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. An elderly woman named Dido, named for our city's founder, grabbed a spear from a fallen defender and drove it into the chest of a Roman legionnaire. Her action inspired others, and within minutes the attack had been beaten back. The sight of that gray-haired grandmother standing over the body of a professional soldier, her hands still gripping the bloody spear, became one of the defining images of our resistance. As the siege entered its second week, I began to notice changes in both armies. The Romans, accustomed to quick victories, showed signs of frustration at our stubborn resistance. Their discipline remained intact, but there was a grimness to their attacks that suggested they had expected this campaign to be over by now. Our own defenders, meanwhile, were developing the skills and confidence that came from surviving repeated combat. Men and women who had been terrified novices were becoming seasoned warriors. But we were also paying a terrible price for our defiance. Food was becoming scarce as our supply lines to the countryside were cut. Medical supplies were running low, and we lacked trained physicians to treat the growing number of wounded. Most critically, we were running short of arrows and other projectiles for our defensive weapons. Hasdrubal addressed these problems with characteristic ingenuity. Foraging parties crept out of the city at night to gather whatever supplies they could find. Wounded defenders who could no longer fight were organized into workshops to produce more arrows and repair damaged equipment. Most importantly, he maintained the morale that was our greatest asset against the Roman war machine. 3 months into the siege, I could hardly recognize the city I had called home for most of my life. The beautiful gardens of Megara lay trampled and burned. The elegant colonnades that had adorned our public buildings were scarred by Roman catapult stones. The harbor that had once welcomed merchant ships from across the Mediterranean now served as our final refuge as the Romans tightened their grip on our walls. Yet something extraordinary had emerged from this destruction. The Carthage that was dying in flames and blood was not the same city that had cowered before Roman demands just months earlier. We had discovered reserves of courage and solidarity that none of us had known we possessed. Rich and poor, citizen and former slave, men and women, all fought together with a unity that our ancestors would have thought impossible. I had been moved to the Citadel district as the Romans systematically captured the outer portions of our city. From this elevated position, I could see the full scope of the catastrophe unfolding below, street by street, building by building. The legions were grinding their way toward the heart of Carthage. Behind them, they left only rubble and the smoke of funeral pyres. The house-to-house fighting was the most brutal aspect of the entire siege. Roman soldiers, frustrated by months of resistance, showed no mercy to the defenders they encountered, but our people fought back with a ferocity that surprised even their enemies. Every room became a fortress, every stairway a battlefield. Families barricaded themselves in their homes and fought to the last arrow, the last kitchen knife, the last clay pot that could be hurled at an invader's head. Hasdrubal continued to move through the city, appearing wherever the fighting was fiercest. His red cloak had become a symbol of hope for our defenders and a target for Roman archers. 3 times I saw him nearly fall to enemy arrows, and 3 times he emerged from the danger with wounds that would have felled a lesser man. His presence alone was worth 1,000 soldiers to our cause. The Romans had established their command post in the ruins of the great council building, the same structure where our leaders had once debated surrender to Rome's impossible demands. The symbolism was not lost on any of us. They were literally sitting atop the grave of our former government, directing the final destruction of everything that Carthage had represented. But we still held the citadel, the temple complex, and the narrow streets of the oldest part of the city. Here, Among buildings that dated back to Dido's original settlement, we prepared to make our final stand. If Carthage was to die, it would die where it had been born, among the stones laid by our ancestors 700 years earlier. Food had become our most critical shortage. The last of our stored grain had been consumed weeks earlier, and now we survived on whatever could be scavenged from the ruins or captured from Roman supply lines. Children grew thin and silent. Old people simply lay down and died rather than consume food that might keep a warrior fighting one more day. Water was almost as scarce. The Romans had contaminated our main cisterns, forcing us to rely on a few wells deep within the citadel complex. We rationed every drop carefully, but everyone understood that thirst would kill us long before Roman swords if the siege continued much longer. Yet somehow, morale remained surprisingly high. Perhaps it was because we had already accepted death as inevitable and found freedom in that acceptance. Perhaps it was because we had proven to ourselves and to the world that Carthage could still fight, or perhaps it was simply because we had nothing left to lose except our dignity, and that was something we would never surrender. The Romans made their final assault on a gray morning when the Mediterranean winds carried the scent of spring flowers from the countryside. It seemed cruelly ironic that new life should be blooming beyond our walls while death stalked through our streets. But then again, perhaps it was fitting that Carthage should die. Just as the world was being reborn, they came from all directions simultaneously, a coordinated attack that threw their remaining reserves against our last defensive positions. The Temple of Tanit, which had stood for centuries as a symbol of our prosperity and devotion, became the scene of desperate hand-to-hand combat. I fought alongside a priest who wielded a bronze ceremonial axe with deadly effectiveness, and a merchant's wife who had become one of our most skilled archers. The fighting raged through the morning and into the afternoon. Step by step, room by room, the Romans pushed us back toward the innermost sanctum of our city. The sounds of battle, clashing metal, screaming voices, crumbling masonry, created a symphony of destruction that would echo in my nightmares for whatever time I had left to dream. By evening, we held nothing but the highest tower of the citadel and the small plaza surrounding it. Perhaps 50 defenders remained, all wounded, all exhausted, but none willing to surrender. Hasdrubal stood among us, his red cloak now torn and blood-stained, his face showing the toll that months of constant warfare had taken on his spirit. The Romans offered us one final chance to surrender. A centurion approached under a flag of truce and delivered the terms: lay down our weapons, and we would be allowed to live as slaves. Resist further, and every man, woman, and child in the citadel would be put to the sword. Hasdrubal's response was to pick up a javelin and hurl it at the centurion's feet. "This is our answer to Rome," he shouted, and the remaining defenders cheered, with voices hoarse from battle cries and smoke. That night, we sat together in the plaza and shared what might have been our last meal, a few scraps of bread and a single skin of wine that someone had been saving for this moment. We talked about our families, our hopes, our fears, and the strange journey that had brought us to this place. Despite everything, I felt more connected to these people than I had ever felt to anyone in my life. As dawn approached, we could hear the Romans preparing for their final assault. Soon their trumpets would sound, their soldiers would charge up the steps of the citadel, and the story of Carthage would come to an end. But we had already achieved something that seemed impossible just months earlier. We had reminded the world that some things are worth dying for. The last entry in the chronicles of our city would not record a shameful surrender or a cowardly flight into exile. Instead, it would tell of a people who faced impossible odds and chose to fight, who transformed themselves from merchants into warriors, who proved that the human spirit cannot be conquered even when the body can be destroyed. Whatever happened in the next few hours, Carthage would die as it had been reborn, with courage, with dignity, and with the knowledge that we had remained true to ourselves until the very end. If you enjoyed learning about this piece of history, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more fascinating stories, and let me know in the comments which historical period you'd like to explore next. The Roman trumpets sounded at dawn, just as we had expected, but something had changed during the night. Not in our resolve, for that remained unshaken, but in the very air around us. A strange peace had settled over the citadel, the peace that comes when all decisions have been made, and nothing remains but to face the consequences with dignity. I stood with my remaining comrades in the small plaza before the Temple of Tanit, watching the sun rise over the Mediterranean for what I knew would be the last time. The irony was not lost on me that this same sea had once carried Carthaginian ships to every corner of the known world. Now, it would witness the end of everything those ships had built. Hasdrubal moved among us one final time, clasping hands, sharing quiet words, preparing us for what was to come. When he reached me, he paused and looked directly into my eyes. "You have been a true son of Carthage," he said simply. "Whatever comes next, remember that we chose this. We chose to fight rather than submit, to die as free men rather than live as slaves. That choice defines us more than any victory could have." The Roman assault began with a rain of arrows that darkened the sky above our heads. We had no shields left to speak of, no armor except what we had improvised from leather and bronze scraps, but we stood our ground, returning what fire we could, determined to make the Romans pay for every step they took toward our sanctuary. They came up the steps of the citadel like a bronze tide, their shields locked together, their spears bristling with deadly intent. The narrow confines of the stairway worked in our favor. They could only attack us with a limited front, allowing us to concentrate our meager forces against their advance. The fighting was fierce but brief. One by one, my comrades fell around me, each death diminishing our ability to resist, but somehow strengthening our resolve to continue. I saw the priest who had wielded his ceremonial axe so effectively finally overwhelmed by 3 Roman legionnaires. The merchant's wife, who had become our finest archer, used her last arrow to take down a centurion before a sword thrust ended her story. I found myself pressed back against the very altar of Tanit herself, the goddess who had watched over Carthage since its founding. With my back to the sacred stone, I faced the advancing Romans with whatever strength remained in my aging limbs. My spear had been broken, my sword was dull with use, but I still had my voice. "Carthage!" I shouted, putting everything I had into that single word. It was defiance and pride, love and loss, hope and despair all rolled into one cry that echoed off the temple wall. Several of my surviving comrades took up the cry, and for a moment, the name of our city rang out above the clash of weapons like a prayer to the gods. Hasdrubal was the last to fall, surrounded by a circle of Roman soldiers, but still fighting with the fury that had carried him out of the desert months earlier. Even as the spears pierced his body, He managed to strike down one more enemy before collapsing beside the altar where generations of Carthaginians had offered sacrifices for the city's prosperity. As for myself, I felt the Roman blade slide between my ribs with surprising gentleness, as if death were offering me a gift rather than taking my life. As I fell to my knees beside Hasdrubal's body, my vision began to dim, but my thoughts remained clear. We had done it. We had shown the world that Carthage could still fight, could still choose death over dishonor, could still be true to the legacy of courage that our ancestors had bequeathed to us. The Romans would burn what remained of our city, salt the earth where it had stood, and try to erase us from memory as completely as they had erased us from the map, but they would never be able to destroy what we had accomplished in these final months. We had transformed ourselves from a defeated people into heroes worthy of our greatest ancestors. Somewhere in the growing darkness, I heard the sound of flames. As the Romans began their systematic destruction of everything that had made Carthage beautiful, the libraries with their scrolls of ancient wisdom, the workshops where craftsmen had perfected their arts over centuries, the homes where families had lived and loved and dreamed, all of it would be reduced to ash and rubble, but they could not burn the memory of what we had chosen to become. They could not destroy the example we had set for future generations who might face similar choices between submission and resistance. They could not erase the truth that some things are worth dying for, and that a people willing to die for their freedom can never be truly conquered. As my consciousness faded, my last thought was not of regret or despair, but of profound gratitude. I had lived to see Carthage remember what it meant to be great. I had witnessed ordinary people transform themselves into extraordinary heroes. I had been part of something larger and more meaningful than my individual life could ever have been. The Third Punic War would end with Rome's complete victory, as everyone had known it would from the beginning. But within that larger defeat lay a smaller triumph that no Roman sword could ever take away. Carthage had chosen to die as it had chosen to live, on its own terms, according to its own values, true to its own vision of what human beings could achieve when they stood together against impossible odds. In the years to come, when Roman historians wrote the official account of these events, they would describe the siege of Carthage as a necessary step in Rome's civilizing mission. They would portray us as stubborn fools who prolonged a hopeless struggle out of pride and ignorance. They would try to make our resistance seem pointless and our sacrifice meaningless. But they would be wrong. Our sacrifice was not pointless. It was the most meaningful thing any of us had ever done. Our resistance was not ignorance. It was the deepest wisdom, the understanding that some defeats are more honorable than any victory. Our pride was not a flaw. It was the divine spark that separates human beings from animals, the quality that makes life worth living even when death is the only alternative. Let Rome build its empire on the ruins of our city. Let them rule the Mediterranean. With their efficient brutality and their mechanical discipline, they will never understand what they destroyed here, because they will never understand what we discovered about ourselves in these final months. We learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear. We learned that freedom is not a political arrangement but a state of mind, something that can exist even in the face of overwhelming force. We learned that love for our families, our city, our values, is stronger than any power that seeks to destroy it. These lessons will survive, even if no stone of Carthage remains standing. Somewhere, in some future time when people face similar choices, The memory of our defiance will inspire them to stand firm. Our story will be told by mothers to their children, by teachers to their students, by leaders to their followers, and in the telling, something of the spirit that burned so brightly in these streets will be rekindled. That is our true victory, not military success, which was always impossible, but moral triumph, which no enemy can ever take away. We chose to be heroes rather than victims, warriors rather than slaves, free people rather than Roman subjects. We chose to write the ending of our own story rather than let others write it for us. As the darkness finally claimed me, I carried with me the absolute certainty that Carthage would live forever, not as a place on any map, but as an idea in the human heart. The idea that resistance is possible, that dignity matters more than survival, that some things are indeed worth dying for. Rome might salt our earth, but they could not salt our memory. And memory, I realized in my final moment of clarity, is the only immortality that truly matters.